Good afternoon and welcome to this CEDA live stream. I'm Ian Learmonth, the Chief Executive Officer of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And today we are going to talk about a new energy technology roadmap, from what to how, and we're going to be discussing the future of the energy mix and what's needed to deliver clean, safe, affordable power. I've got a terrific panel with me today. I'm very excited about introducing them to you in a minute or so. But just a few housekeeping items while we kick off. Like many at the height of this pandemic, CEDA have their programs, their forums and discussions have of course moved online, but they will return in due course to face-to-face events where they will continue to allow us to participate in and discuss in an informed way critical issues that the country faces. Now, to keep abreast of a range of events and discussions on these important topics around the country's economic and social development, I encourage you to visit CEDA's website, which is ceda.com.au, and you can register for upcoming events and you can have a look at past live streams. CEDA also, of course, produce regular podcasts, video interviews, blogs with the leading experts and policy makers that allow you to keep up to date with quality information, key issues on the economy very broadly, cover lots of issues, talking energy today, but on other occasions CEDA will talk health, they'll talk resources, all sorts of things, all available, as I say, through the CEDA website. Now, today, like all the CEDA public events, you will be able to interact with my array of speakers through the Q&A portal, which is available via the link below on the video on your screen, or you can enter in the details by going to CEDA, as in CEDA, .pigeonhole.at. There we go. Helpfully, that is now up on your screen. So you can see how you could take yourself through to that portal. And if you use the passcode ENERGY, uppercase, you will be able to ask questions which we will endeavour to answer. You can also join the conversation on Twitter via today's hashtag, which is hashtag EnergyFuture, and tagging CEDA by using the @CEDA_news. So that would be the way to go if people want to participate in that way. CEDA acknowledges that we are also on Aboriginal land today. I am here in Sydney on Gadigal land, and I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We CEDA, we are all committed to the recognition and reconciliation. We respect elders and support their stated aspirations. I'd also like to thank our sponsors today, Siemens. So we're going to hear from them very soon. And without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So firstly, we've got Michael Bielinski, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Siemens Australia. So very pleased to have Michael here. We've got Alex Wonhas from AEMO, who is the Chief System Design and Engineering Officer there. And last but not least, Andrew Horvath, who is the group chairman, the global group chairman of Star Scientific. So welcome to all my panel. Now, I'm going to start off by allowing each of them to make some opening remarks. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael, who will lead off. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Ian. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to spend a few minutes, maybe around 5 minutes, just having a discussion around what could a new energy technology roadmap look like for energy in Australia, particularly in the context of the federal government's recently released technology investment roadmap. So we'll have some discussions now and then have a sort of a panel discussion. I guess as a set of introductory comments, I'd like to spend a few minutes framing the discussion in terms of the future of energy for Australia. So maybe to start, to remind ourselves why we're even interested in this discussion, and it's all around CO2 emissions. So our goal as a nation is to decarbonise our energy system emissions. And our problem is how to move from a heavily fossil-fuelled energy economy to one that's essentially not reliant on fossil fuels anymore. So in terms of the discussion here, it's really a problem definition, which is a techno-economic one, where we want to work out how we can use technology, or either new technology or old technology in new ways, to economically reduce CO2 emissions while keeping the lights on and keeping cars running and aeroplanes flying and all those things. So I guess it's maybe interesting just to note for a second, where do those emissions come from in our economy at the moment? So there's around 30% comes from power generation, because we're still quite heavily fossil fuel power generation, something like 25% from transport, and then 45% from other parts of industry and agriculture and so on. What that means is, of course, it's not just power generation that we should focus on. Currently, the best technologies we have to replace fossil fuels as an energy source is solar PV and wind, supplemented somehow by hydro in Australia. Our challenge, of course, is that those renewables, particularly solar and wind, are quite intermittent. And because of the intermittency issue, in order to provide energy to society in the way society wants to absorb that energy, we do need some form of large-scale storage. And the storage issue really is a key issue for our future of energy. So generally, when we talk about the future of energy, we can envisage a future world where we generate all of our electricity, and in fact, most of our energy, renewably using wind and solar and some hydro. And then we store that electricity via pump storage hydro, via batteries, via chemical carrier technologies, particularly we think via hydrogen is a real focus. So we're generating it renewably, we're storing it because we can't generate it all the time. And then we utilize that renewable energy as electricity, as hydrogen gas, for example, in heavy goods vehicles, potentially being burned in gas turbines and so on, and as a group of chemical derivatives like green methanol, like ammonia for transport and so on. So that picture, that's a far distant future picture, but I think it's a framework I think we'd like to propose as one to think about how we make decisions for the near future. And I think the interesting thing to note is we have the technologies now to do all of those things. The challenge is how to make those technologies economic and how to scale them, and in particular, how to then manage this transition from our current, still quite heavily fossil fuel-based energy economy to an energy system that's reliable and affordable, both at the end point and during the transition. So I think that's my summary for a framework for the discussion. So having said those things, I'd like to hand over to Alex Wonhas from AEMO, maybe to give us an insight on the views of the world from AEMO.
Michael, thank you very much for this introduction, and a good afternoon to everyone. I think you have quite rightly highlighted how the energy transition is really absolutely important for us as a nation. What I think is really important to remember is this is not just some event that will happen in the future. This is actually something that is already happening today, and our energy system has already started to transform at an absolutely breakneck speed. So there's some great work that Andy Blakers and Ken Baldwin have done at the ANU, and they looked at the speed of this transition. And when you look at the data, Australia is actually leading the world at the moment in this transition. We are installing the most renewable energy capacity per capita compared to any other country on the planet. And we are not just leading this transformation, but in fact, we are smashing the competition in upper strokes out of the park. So the runner-up, the Germans, they are installing only half the capacity compared to us. So this is happening now. This is not optional. So the questions we have to solve is not a question of if, but it's just a question of how fast is it going to be and how big is it going to be. I think it is also quite important to highlight that this transition of the system is not an easy transition. And at AEMO, we see this in our day-to-day life by actually getting all of the different technologies together and making them work as a system. So we as a nation need to be prepared. What does this entail? It actually entails a whole range of things. It entails that we need to get our market and regulatory regime right to send the right investment signals to investors so that we build the right mix of different technologies. We also need to make sure that all of the new technologies have the right standards, for example, rooftop solar panels, distributed batteries, etc., so we can make them work as an integrated system. And we also need some targeted investment into new transmission infrastructure to mesh all of this together. So how does this plan look like? Well, about 4 weeks ago, AEMO has published its 2020 integrated system plan that tries to outline what this roadmap is looking like. And it's really important to highlight that this is not just some effort of, a couple of admittedly quite brilliant engineers who are sitting in AEMO and dreaming all of this up. But what I was really pleased over the last, frankly, 18 months of developing this work is the amazing input that over 200 stakeholders in a whole raft of different workshops and webinars have provided to us to really shape a really good understanding of the future. So what we are seeing, which is aligned to the themes that Michael's highlighted, the key driver of this transition is that just by reaching the end of life, the existing generation fleet in Australia is retiring. In fact, almost 2/3 of coal-fired generators that are currently in the system providing the base load in the system will be gone in the next 20 years. So we need to replace this capacity. We expect to see a very significant ramp up of distributed energy resources such as rooftop solar. In fact, they will, depending on the estimate, double or even triple and provide over or up to 22% of total energy. We also need to replace a lot of the bulk energy in the system, and we expect 26 gigawatts of new large-scale renewables to come into the system. But I think, as Michael's also highlighted, we need to make sure that power is available if and when consumers demand it. So we need up to 19 gigawatts of dispatchable resources to come into the system. And it's quite amazing to see the plethora of new energy technologies coming into the market and demonstrating their capabilities, such as batteries, and I'm sure we can talk about more later about this. All in all, as a nation, we face basically an investment task of about $100 billion. And we need to get that right. And what we have certainly seen in our analysis, if we make the right strategic investments, if we get the market and the regulatory setting right, we can actually save consumers around $11 billion during this transition. So that is something that we are quite passionate about.
Thanks, Alex. That's a terrific framing of the challenge ahead of us. And I'm now, and of course, we'll return to the ISP, I'm sure, over the course of the discussion. I'm now going to hand it over to Andrew to give us some opening remarks. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Ian. Look, I agree with Alex and Michael that we have a very interesting task ahead of us. The world is rapidly changing. I think the concept of brute force over nature is dead. You see young CEO and politicians rising up, can't have fossil-stained fingers. You see divestment in fossil happening at a remarkable rate. And looking at this and looking at what the government's energy roadmap plans are and this discussion is incredibly timely. We are sort of entering a phase, though, where we have to be very, very careful that we don't discount things that are happening in the world. The flaw I see in the preliminary paperwork, because the actual paperwork hasn't been issued yet until mid-September, but the flaw I see is the use of hydrogen. Now, that's where Star Scientific lives, and that'll be the topic I talk about later. But we see that hydrogen's going to have to be used a lot more as a storage medium. There is a way to use hydrogen to produce power, desalination, and various other things, including heat in industry. And increasingly in the world, and as I said, this is the world we live in, where we talk to governments and other major bodies around the world on a daily basis. Hydrogen is becoming the go-to solution for the future. So it'll be an interesting discussion. I'm keen to hear what everyone has to say, and I'll hand it back to you, Ian.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'd quite like to sort of stay at the level of the the interconnection of the greater energy system initially, and picking up maybe a bit on what Alex has touched on in terms of the challenges that AEMO see in terms of the integrated system plan in the next 20 years. You talk about a significant amount of renewable energy being required in the ISP. I think it's 26 gigawatts. You've got 19 gigawatts of dispatchable power. There's a great deal also of interconnection and upgrade to transmission that's going to be needed. Some of this is owned by the states today. Some of it has been privatised in certain states, notably New South Wales and Victoria. How do you see that whole coordination effort working, Alex? And what rules, regulations, and reforms might need to be introduced to help with that all?
Thank you very much, Ian. I think you are absolutely right. Targeted investment into the right transmission project is in our view quite vital and will actually unlock those $11 billion in consumer benefits that we've highlighted. What has happened this year with the integrated system plan, this is actually the first time is so-called an actionable plan. So that means following the publication of this document, we have been able to declare a number of projects actionable, and that means that the respective network service provider is now actually tasked to go through an accelerated review process and to implement this project if it still demonstrates its consumer benefits. And there's a whole pipeline of different projects that we need to build. So there is Project Energy Connect that connects South Australia with New South Wales. There is HumeLink that's going to connect Snowy with New South Wales. There may be VNI West if we can manage the cost to connect it to Victoria. There is Mariners Link that's going to connect Tasmania with Victoria, and there's also the Queensland to New South Wales interconnector to connect those states. And what that does is actually helps us to more efficiently balance the resources, and along the way also creates new connection points for this very significant uptake of renewable energy capacity that we will require. Yeah, and it's going to be it's going to be a complex, and it's going to be a long game, I'm sure. Just to remind the audience that we're very much, and some of the first questions are kind of arriving. Feel free to ask myself or the panel questions, which we will endeavour to get back to you. But while we're building up on those, I guess there we go. Thank you. You can see just how you get into the platform there. Just a reminder. Talk about storage for a minute. And there's of course different types of storage. There's battery storage at the household level, and even we're seeing the first of the utility scale batteries out there, most notably in South Australia with Hornsdale, and new ones of course coming online. They're playing a particular role in helping with the grid. And then of course we've got much talk of larger scale storage, notably again through pump storage, hydro, and Snowy 2.0 being a spectacular example of that. I wonder whether, Michael, you might talk a little bit about
those two ends of the battery spectrum, how they might interface with each other, what we're going to need, and how we might get to the economics to invest in that?
Thanks, Ian. So that's a very complex question to try and answer. Look, I think maybe if I can make a couple of different stage comments. Certainly there are many battery systems both being built and proposed to be built. Currently, that technology looks quite good for timeframes in the single-digit number of hours. The question with batteries is, will the economics of batteries then work in the longer term for longer term storage? At the other end of the storage spectrum, then is the chemical storage in terms of most likely hydrogen or derivatives of hydrogen. And there we are still at a very early stage in the building and in industry in Australia. So, for example, we're currently building a 1.25 megawatt electrolyzer in South Australia for AGIG. That's actually quite a small device. So we're very early in the piece, even relative to battery technologies. I think if I can maybe do a thought experiment just to demonstrate to people the magnitude of the stories that we might be looking at. So we talked about snow, you mentioned snowy hydro, but if we just take a minute. So if you build solar PV, a 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre array will generate about 100 megawatts, just as a rule of thumb. Now in Australia, as an average, we're consuming about 30,000 megawatts of electricity throughout the year on average. So then you need, let's say if you're providing all of that by PV, you'd say I need 30,000 megawatts all day long or year long, but actually PV has a capacity factor of about 30%. So you need 3 times that. You need 90,000 megawatts of PV to cover the average load in Australia. Okay. As it turns out, that's a square 30 kilometres by 30 kilometres of PV cells. So that's, on the one hand, a lot. On the other hand, I think people could say, well, 30 kilometres by 30 kilometres is something I can understand. Okay, so that picture of a 30 kilometre by 30 kilometre array, it's providing all of the electricity Australia needs, but for 8 hours a day, it's 3 times what we need, and for 12 hours a day, it's nothing. So you need to store the 2/3. Okay, so this is a storage exercise. So how do you store 12 hours of energy that's 60,000 megawatts? So that's about 700,000 megawatt hours. You say, okay, what does that mean in terms of numbers? Well, as it turns out, that's about double the capacity of Snowy 2. So Snowy 2.0 has a capacity of around 350 gigawatt hours. Okay, so from a storage perspective, we're saying Snowy 2.0 stores about half what we need to store to get through a complete day. And so on the one hand, you'd say that gets us quite a long way. The other piece of information, though, is Snowy 2.0 can only generate 2,000 megawatts. Now, 2,000 megawatts is a big coal-fired power station, so it's a lot. But at 2,000 megawatts, we need 15 Snowy 2.0s to cover us for the 12 hours a day where the PV is not generating. Okay, so I've tried to make that simple, but I've probably made it complicated. But what that gives you a feel for is to build 15 Snowy 2.0s is a huge task. And that's more storage than we need, because Snowy can run for 7 days at 2,000 megawatts. But in terms of the magnitude of storage required, if we go to 100% renewable, it's a very big number. Okay, and that example I gave of a 30 kilometre by 30 kilometre PV generating plant, that only replaces Australia's electricity. We'd also like to replace the natural gas we burn and the petrol we consume. Then you can double or maybe multiply that by 2.5 in terms of the renewable generation capacity we need and then the storage we need. So, and I think the final point of that is, I guess, that magnitude of storage for me as batteries seems unlikely as a purely battery. So I think there's always more than one solution to these problems. But it would seem to me that using chemical storage as hydrogen or its derivatives, ammonia, methanol, and so on, they would seem to be a way that you can store that amount of energy for the country and then provide the energy when consumers need it. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded an answer for your storage question, but give everybody a feel for the magnitude of the things we're talking about.
No, that was terrific, Michael. That was certainly gave me a perspective on land requirement relative to PV and the storage challenge at a large scale. But we of course keep hearing that, and we know that equally along with that storage, we will need batteries to help with frequency and voltage and filling in all those more immediate gaps as well. I thought we might talk a bit about hydrogen for a while, and we can come back to some of these other issues. And there's a few questions coming through on hydrogen. I'm going to pick it up with Andrew. And one of them somewhat dramatically talks about, the last time I heard about hydrogen, it was in the context of the Hindenburg. It's been the fuel source of tomorrow for so long. People, I remember as a university student, Joe Bjelke-Petersen, the Premier of Queensland at the time, talking about hydrogen fueled vehicles. But I think it'd be very interesting so Andrew, maybe to frame that, tell us a bit about what Star Scientific's trying to do, and what does the future really look like for hydrogen? Is it about getting electrolyzers and PV and getting down to $2 a kilogram? And so maybe start with your technology, Andrew, but paint the picture for what we see as the hydrogen future.
Yeah, sure, Ian. So Star Scientific has developed a catalyst. So we're in the heat making business. So we've developed a catalyst that doesn't require energy input, simply introduce hydrogen oxygen to the catalyst, and in 3 minutes you have 800 degrees. That sort of temperature allows you to power industry, but it also allows you to make steam for existing turbines. If you had a really good power station, you could theoretically change the boiler, and you would end up with a zero emissions power station that isn't coal handling or pollution making anymore. So there's significant costs. I suppose where the world's going at the moment and where we're seeing the world moving is a couple places. We're seeing offshore wind, floating wind is becoming a really big platform for hydrogen manufacture, as well as solar PV and onshore wind. Hydrogen as a storage factor seems to be heading more and more toward liquid hydrogen, and that's being driven by the Japanese and the Germans at the moment. So in terms of storage, Michael's quite right. The beauty with hydrogen, though, is you would store it in hubs where you need it. So you won't have to build massive dams, in key locations to keep powering things. You would be able to do it with hydrogen. So you do have to produce a lot of power. There are losses, there's no doubt about that, but the type of electrolyzers that are being developed at the moment, and there's a couple that are about to go into mass production, are coming down in cost. The cost of the electrolyzer and the cost of the hydrogen is coming down significantly. I don't think the $2 is going to be an issue much longer. So we have that. So Star's view of the world is that we look at the ability to use industrial heat, desalination through multi-phase desalination. We look at the ability, if we want to rapidly reduce CO2, of converting existing power stations. Now, perhaps in Australia, that's not going to be a goer because they're fairly old. But in Japan, there's a vast array of very new power plants. In Germany as well. Give an example, there's a plant called Moorburg in Hamburg, and that plant is 3.5 years, 4 years old, and they're already wanting to shut it down. And it's a massive investment. To turn that into a zero emissions plant using our technology is perfectly feasible. And in fact, we're in discussions with them at the moment. So that's where we see it. The biggest advance that we see, however, is CO2 turbines, supercritical CO2. So just for the people who, it sounds a bit scary, CO2 turbines, supercritical turbines are simply CO2 at a very high pressure, very high temperature. It stops acting like a gas, acts more like a fluid, becomes something that can spin a turbine really, really well. The beauty of these things are they're 10% of the size of a standard turbine, don't need water cooling, and for 10 megawatts are about the size of an average desk. So they're wonderful if we want to have a smart grid system. So to lay out, say, 50 megawatt turbines around the country and work in a smart grid. That seems to be the way a lot of America is moving. These things are used. They've been used in Japan in nuclear power plants for a long time, although they use helium. And in fact, Siemens was researching helium for a long time through the 70s. So we see that those sort of things are very, very doable. What concerns me with Australia is that I think we're a little bit behind the game in terms of how fast other countries are working toward putting down, 10, 50, 100 gigawatt plants solely to make hydrogen. And when you look at it as a complete unit, as a complete plant, it actually becomes quite cost effective. So you're seeing in North Africa, there are plans. If you look up Europe at the moment, even all the European countries have agreed on what you can use in terms of piping through all their countries. So they've all agreed where all the hydrogen pipes are going to flow already. So there's a lot of advancement there. And Australia is obviously in a prime position with its sun, with its wind, especially offshore wind, to make a lot of money from hydrogen, but also to use hydrogen. The last point I want to make is that the zero emission or net zero argument is becoming very, very strong. And I'm sure those in the audience know that. A lot of places are looking to become completely net zero because they want to be able to manufacture goods at net zero, because a lot of companies now want investors to come back to them because they can guarantee that their products are going to be, net zero and slavery free and pollution, recyclable. So they're the key things that are driving the hydrogen markets around the world, but they're moving very, very quickly.
Yes, it's a very exciting technology. Obviously, the technology roadmap, which is the government's policy around identifying future technologies that are going to help with this energy transition. Hydrogen is, of course, front and centre. And at the CEFC, we have been instructed to invest $300 million into the sector. We're kind of working on projects already in that regard. Nothing quite sort of completed or announceable at this stage, but we're also working closely with ARENA, who have got $70 million, and they're running a grant program, and all, they've got, I think, a terrific response from the market here in Australia of various projects. So I suspect we're going to hear a lot more about hydrogen over the coming years, in fact, maybe even over the coming next 12 to 24 months. In terms of that, Alex, with the ISP, I know there's a reference, of course, to hydrogen, but is that incorporated into the ISP, or are you more focused on more conventional and mature forms of storage for your planning?
No, great question, Ian. So it is right that the current ISP that we've just published, it does mention hydrogen, but we haven't actually spent a lot of time analysing the impacts that hydrogen could have on the Australian system. I think as Andrew and Michael have highlighted, hydrogen has an absolute potential to transform the system in the future. And what we are going to do in the next ISP, which is the 2022 ISP, we'll actually put a really great focus on hydrogen. Our view is that there's actually a lot of very immediate challenges that we need to solve in the system, and really the sort of the 5 to 10 year time frame. And hopefully by that time, the cost of hydrogen production will further decline, and then open up a new dispatchable technology for us all to utilize, as has been just described. And that will be very valuable, because there is no single silver bullet to the transformation of the energy system. I think the real key to success will be having all of these different technology options available, and then making a balanced investment decision to, for instance, long-term storage hydrogen will really play to its strengths, shorter term, fast frequency response, maybe batteries. And so the mix will be important, but we'll be looking at that going forward. But it's a very exciting technology.
Thanks, Alex. And just, while I've got you, a couple of questions that have come through that I think, are interesting. And I guess they're talking about, I guess I'm changing subjects slightly, but got two questions here that are really related to the challenges around the power system, the very rapid uptake in renewables, and some of the more recent disasters that we've had, like the bushfires and so on. And that's led to load shedding, amongst other things. And in fact, I was reading today Audrey Zibelman, your chief executive, talking about with extraordinary uptake of distributed energy rooftop solar in this country, that increasingly you may need to intervene and shed at appropriate times, or distributed utilities may need to be shed at the right time. Wondered if you might talk a little bit about that challenge, the duck curve as they talk about, and the reduction in demand over the next decade of energy during the day, and what AEMO is thinking about how it might address that particular issue.
Yes, so you are actually referring to another document that we have in fact published today, which is called the Electricity Statement of Opportunity, which we publish sort of every year this time round to really have a forward look of what we are seeing coming up in the next summer. So what we are really interested in is that we have enough of those dispatchable resources available so that on a really hot day, people can still turn on their air conditioner, get secure and reliable power. So there's a lot of work going into that. And that has been, been the focus of what we have over many, many years tried to manage, this reliability of the system. And as you have highlighted, last summer was very, very difficult. And I think it's been thanks to the efforts of many people who've worked really, really hard to actually keep the system stable throughout those bushfires. Actually, the good news is through uptake of new technologies, in particular renewables, we actually see much less challenge to our ability to provide power even during those peak times, although in particular as a result of COVID, sort of our uncertainty range has increased. But we are now seeing new challenges emerge, and you were referring to that, the duck curve. So it's really because we have now so much solar power deployed that in the middle of the day when the sun's obviously shining, we see actually power coming down. So we have the minimum power usage in most states of the DEM now in the middle of the day instead of at night where it historically has been. And we're getting in some instances to the point where actually the demand on the network is approaching zero. And that's, again, a very, very challenging situation to manage the system, because the system actually needs a little bit of sort of tension and power draw to keep it stable. And we need to prepare for that, and we need to manage that. And one of the management techniques is that really on the rare occasion where you have a day where there is very little demand, the sun's shining really a lot, maybe then in very targeted fashion, maybe turning off solar output just to keep the system stable. But I think that would be similarly managed to when, for instance, on a really hot day, we don't have enough supply and we might have to turn off some supply. So it's really just an emergency measure. I think what is much better to do is actually, as we have all agreed, let's actually build the system in a way so it can absorb this energy, manage it. That's where storage comes in. So if you have a battery or an electrolyzer that you can turn on those minimum demand days, that's exactly what the system needs. So that's why it's so important to get these technologies into the system to make it work.
Thanks, Alex. And plenty of ISP questions coming through, but we'll just go back to the economics of storage for a minute. And question for you, Michael, that I'm seeing here, about whether the dramatic drop or the expected drop in battery storage costs over time, well, will they be sufficient for batteries to play the role that they're needed to? And may they even, in fact, overcome the need for any hydrogen storage as well? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the that kind of cost curve, particularly around chemical battery storage.
Sure. And I think this is one of these crystal ball questions that's actually very difficult to answer. Maybe if I can come at it from a slightly different perspective, I agree very much with what one of the points Alex just made, which is there's not one right answer to this. It will be a mix of different technologies for the different purposes. So certainly the batteries are coming down the cost curve. They look like the solution for that short-term storage and contributing to frequency response and so on. One of the benefits of hydrogen is its ability also to be used for road transportation, for long-term storage, also for power generation, for burning in gas turbines, for example, but also conversion to liquid fuels that can be utilised in motor cars and for aeroplanes and for transport to other countries. So you've seen the Alan Finkel report of our hydrogen strategy for the nation. One of the very interesting concepts for us as a nation is if we build all of this renewable energy, we actually make more than we need in Australia, and we use the excess to produce hydrogen, which we export as liquid hydrogen, as ammonia, as methanol or its byproducts, depending what the end usage is for. And I think it's quite unclear at the moment whether the optimal transport route is liquid hydrogen, methanol or ammonia. That's still being determined. But I think given all of those uses of hydrogen and the fact there's a long-term storage mechanism, either hydrogen or the other chemical products, our view is the long-term storage looks chemical, whereas the short-term storage, notwithstanding the very good reductions in the costs of batteries, are probably with batteries.
No, and I think, yes, we're going to see how that unfolds over the coming years. And, we were very pleased to be part of the first project financing of a grid-scale battery project, which was the upgrade, the extra 50 megawatts that was added at Hornsdale with the Tesla Big Battery last year. So, we hope CEFC can be part of supporting those technologies with our debt or equity, in fact. Question, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are popping up, and there's so many particularly around grid-related matters. And so maybe a bit back to you, Alex, if that's all right. Electricity transmission has been identified as a weak link for many years. Why has this been a problem for so long, and why hasn't it already been fixed? Sounds easy if you say it quickly.
It's a really good question. I think it required us as a nation, frankly, to take a complete mindset shift. Because historically, we had a really perfectly running energy system, low prices, fairly stable, and apart from the CO2 emissions, it was going great. And we've actually put a lot of thinking and effort into really minimize expenditure on the system to keep consumer prices low. And I think that's worked well. However, we are now facing this massive transformation. We are taking a lot of existing generators out, and we are building, for the right reasons, the new generators in completely different locations. And that's actually economically efficient, but it does require an investment in the network infrastructure. And it probably took us a long time to recognize that we actually need to design and plan the system and need to put the right processes and mechanisms and plans in place. And yes, we have now a plan and we are starting to put it in place. But, should we have seen this 10 years ago? Probably. But anyway, we haven't. we have what we have now, so we can do two things. One is we just need to tactically solve the issues that we're having today, and that's what we're doing. And the best day to plant a tree was 10 years ago. Well, the second best day is today. So let's start and get on with the job.
Yeah, thank you. And just while we're talking about that transition, and I'm harking a little bit back to the ISP, obviously the role of gas is a very significant one, and arguably in some cases a contentious one. Just your, gas is obviously part of your 19 gigawatts of dispatchable energy in the plan. Maybe I'll throw this question to Andrew, actually, if that's okay. I mean, how do you see gas's role over the coming decade or two? Is it a changing one? Are we going to need? What are the expectations of gas over the coming decade or so?
Look, it definitely has a role to play. There's no doubt. I think everybody here is 100% correct. This is a mix. It's going to be a mix of things. I think, we have disagreements on how ultimately you're going to generate electrons. I mean, we still believe spinning mass is cleverer than trying to play with solar. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have a gas mix. I think in the early days of hydrogen, especially blue hydrogen, which is a derivative of gas, and where they store the CO2, or they convert it to graphene, or they do other things with it, will definitely be a mix in it. I don't think it will be that long, because the EU has already declared that they are very much preferenced to green hydrogen. So you're already seeing the really big uptake of that, and especially the 65 billion euro they've just put toward that is green hydrogen. So, but it's definitely going to have to play. It's going to have to play a role in the next 10 years to see us wean ourselves off fossil.
Yeah. No, thanks, Andrew. I've got a question here about nuclear. We have the resources, we have the right conditions. Compared to coal, its environmental impact is almost zero. Maybe for you, Michael, why don't we don't have aspirations in the nuclear regard?
Thanks, Ian. Look, I think a couple of things. I think the political reality in Australia is that even if the country started making progress now towards a nuclear future, we take 10 years to make a decision, and then 10 years to actually have our first nuclear plant running, and then another 10 years, or 30 years before we've got a reasonably small fleet of nuclear plants. During that time, the lights have gone out if we're still trying to achieve our carbon emission targets. So I think there's both the political reality and then the technological realities that say we've probably got the technologies now that we can do what we need to do with our carbon emission targets without going nuclear. And then there are all of the issues around nuclear. I think they're well debated around both the risks of plants and then what you do with the remnants of the plants and the spent fuel. So I think my view would be, because we don't need to, is probably the right answer. Yeah. It may in the short term be slightly more expensive to do what we're doing, but in the longer term, it would seem to be the better thing. And if we don't need to, then why go that way?
No, I think that's a very sounds like a very sound advice. And in fact, at the CEFC, we're there are two express preclusions of investment areas for us, and one is nuclear and the other is carbon capture and storage. So while we're on those two topics, I might throw a question, because we've got one from our audience here around carbon capture and storage. It's been, of course, name checked in the government's technology roadmap. It's had sort of, I guess, more uptake in markets like the US than there's some carbon capture and storage activity in Australia, notably up there in WA in the Gorgon refinery. But I'm not sure whether, maybe I'll throw this one at Alex, if that's all right. I don't know. I suspect carbon capture and storage doesn't feature in the ISP, so I may be asking you as an energy expert more broadly. Others feel free to chime in. Is carbon capture and storage the answer? This is probably a broader emissions reduction question. Do we see that? We see a bit more of it in offshore markets. What are its prospects? What's relevant in that conversation?
So I think carbon capture and storage is a really important technology, as you have alluded to. There are actually some areas where it's almost the only option or one of the few options to reduce emissions. So, for example, when you produce cement, you also produce a lot of CO2. So you have to capture that. And if you can sequester it either under the ground or you can use some other mechanisms, that is really, really valuable. I think, as you've also highlighted, one of the reasons why Australia's carbon emissions have increased lately is actually it's a byproduct often of gas production, and some gas wells contain a lot of CO2. And so instead of releasing it into the atmosphere, it's actually relatively straightforward to capture it and to sequester in Gorgon as an example of that. Now, with regards to carbon capture and storage in the power sector, we are sort of looking at this as part of the ISP because we are actually using the generation cost data from CSIRO in our analysis. But when you basically do a least cost comparison analysis, we think we can solve the question of how do you provide least cost power to consumers actually with the existing technologies. And it's effectively that wind, solar, firmed with a mix of different technologies is in the end cheaper than using at the moment carbon capture and storage. But that's just a specific for the Australian energy sector at the moment.
Alex, that's also our experience. So Siemens globally was involved in this technology, and the economics of capturing the CO2 from the exhaust of large coal-fired power stations, for example, is really poor. I think there's no other way to describe it. And then you've got the added complexity that, unfortunately, most coal-fired power stations are not also located near where there is suitable geology to actually store the CO2 underground. Certainly, CCS for us is interesting. The oil and gas industry, as you mentioned, Gorgon. We're also Santos is promoting a project now, I think, in the Moomba Basin for storing carbon dioxide from its gas fields in those areas where you've got production and the ability to store in one location or close to each other. Then it becomes quite interesting. It's one of a mix of solutions as well to enable us, particularly during this transition, to burn some fossil fuels while mitigating the CO2 emissions.
Thanks, Michael. We're coming towards the end of the session. I just remind everyone that there's, if they go into the portal, there is the poll there, which I haven't really talked much about so far, but it's really three questions with the poll. It's asking, I don't know whether the CEDA people can throw up the current results, but the first question is where the greatest opportunities are for reducing CO2 in the economy. Is it about generation of electricity, consuming electricity, or distribution of electricity, consumption of gas, or consumption of petroleum products? Needless to say that the generation of electricity seems to be the audience vote on the greatest opportunity for reducing CO2. Second question, it was, is there enough meaningful and fact-based debate and discussion on how Australia can reach a balance between price of energy, having reliable energy, and meeting environmental objectives? And the yes is 9% and the no's are 90%. So maybe that's, I think we've been having the debate about reliable, affordable and clean energy for a long time, and maybe that will continue. The third question was, the current energy debate is more fact-based or emotional-based, and 93% of respondents today have said it's more emotional-based. So I'm not sure if anyone's been surprised by it.
Can I make one comment? I think the answers on the place to start on improving our carbon emissions. So I propose to disagree with the audience. I think it's pretty well known that the most cost-effective, easiest and fastest way to reduce our carbon emissions is to use less energy. And using less energy typically means being more efficient about it. So it's not about not heating your house, it's heating your house more efficiently. So energy efficiency reduction, energy efficiency improvement measures, they're not as sexy as hydrogen or as batteries or wind or solar or whatever, but actually that's the place to start in the economy.
I couldn't agree more, Michael. And at the CEFC, half of our investment portfolio, and we've invested, we've got commitments of something like $6 billion out there today. Approximately half of those commitments, those transactions, more than 100 or so large scale and many thousands of smaller scale ones, are in the area of energy efficiency, not necessarily in wind, solar, batteries, hydro and so on. And you're absolutely right. Emissions are not confined to the electricity sector. People do get somewhat obsessed about it, and they're more like 30% or so of emissions. There is agriculture, infrastructure, real estate sector. There's just industry, for example, the resources sector. There's so many others, transportation, and getting Australia to move from internal combustion engine cars to hybrids to electric vehicles. All those areas are, if we're going to, transition to a carbon-free economy, we're going to have to work not just in the electricity sector. So that is a point very well made. I am going to now wrap up because we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank Michael Bielinski, Andrew Horvath and Andrew Wonhas, my three panellists. That's fantastic. Thank you for your time, your contribution. I want to thank Siemens again as our sponsor for today's CEDA web streamed session. Viewers can post, there we go, there's Siemens up there in lights. Viewers can post additional questions if they wish for the next 15 minutes, and they will be shared in the CEDA post-event email. So don't feel that was quite the end of the matter. As I say, that post-event email will not only include those questions, but would also allow you to access a link of the recording of the live stream. The next CEDA event is on the 1st of September, I'm told. So that's next Tuesday, and that will be on the digitalisation of services. Thank you again, everyone. Another round of thanks to my speakers. I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else did. And we look forward to seeing you at the next CEDA live session. Thank you very much.